You feel the dust first, fine as talcum, settling on your lips with that alkaline tang of sage and rimrock. The sun is 3 fingers above the western ridge, maybe 4 o'clock on an August afternoon in 1873, and you are crouched behind a wagon wheel that smells of axle grease and dry rot. 200 yards out, across a wash carved by spring runoff, you can see movement in the scrub oak, dark shapes that might be men or might be shadows, but the livestock are spooked, and that tells you enough. You exhale slowly, feeling your heartbeat in your throat, and somewhere behind you, a woman is singing a hymn to keep the children calm. Drop your state in the comments and subscribe. The rifle across your knees is 44 inches long, weighs 9 pounds even, and has a name scratched into the buttstock in letters so worn you can barely read them anymore. This story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The weapon in question was a Sharps Model 1870, but not the standard cavalry carbine, and not the heavy target rifle the buffalo runners favored. This one carried a peculiar designation in the ledgers of the Sharps Rifle Manufacturing Company, a special order placed in April of 1871 by a consortium of settlement committees from the Nebraska and Kansas territories, delivered in lots of 12 over the next 18 months. The bore was .45 caliber, the barrel 30 inches with a twist rate optimized for paper-patched bullets cast at 420 grains, and the tang sight had been milled to specifications that allowed holdover out to 700 yards under ideal conditions. Each rifle cost $42, nearly twice the price of a standard Sharps, and each was accompanied by a wooden case containing 500 preloaded cartridges, a bullet mold, a powder measure marked in grains, and a single-page instruction sheet printed in English and German. The consortium purchased 78 of these rifles. Within 3 years they would be credited by territorial militias, wagon trainmasters, and federal cavalry officers with preventing the complete abandonment of 17 settlements along the Platte River corridor and saving an estimated 340 lives in documented engagements where they were deployed. But the rifle itself was only part of the equation. The man who designed the modifications was named Ezekiel Marsh, a former civilian marksmanship instructor at Fort Leavenworth who had resigned his post in 1869 after a disagreement with the post commander over training protocols. Marsh was 41 years old, lean as a fence post, with hands that trembled slightly at rest but steadied the moment they touched wood or metal. He had learned to shoot in the mountains of East Tennessee, hunting squirrels with a caplock rifle his grandfather had carried at New Orleans, and he understood ballistics the way a good riverman understood current, by feel and repetition and an attention to small variations that most men never noticed. He had served as a sharpshooter with the Army of the Cumberland during the war, credited with 43 confirmed eliminations at ranges exceeding 400 yards, though the records listed him only as a scout attached to the 18th Ohio Infantry. After the war he drifted west, worked as a surveyor, then as a shooting instructor, and finally settled in Omaha, where he opened a small gunsmithing shop on Farnham Street. The settlements along the Platte were dying in inches, not from pitched battles or dramatic sieges, but from attrition, stolen livestock, burned hay stores, sniping from distant ridge lines that kept farmers pinned in their cabins for days at a time. The Pawnee had been moved to reservations, but Sioux and Cheyenne raiding parties still crossed the river in summer, and there were white renegades, too, men who had gone feral after the war and saw the scattered homesteads as easy targets. A family could lose half their cattle in a single night. A man walking to his barn at dawn might take an arrow between the shoulder blades from 300 yards out. The territorial militia was stretched thin. The cavalry was focused on the railroad construction zones farther west, and most settlers carried shotguns or old muzzle-loaders that were useless beyond 100 paces. In March of 1871, a delegation of settlement leaders met in Omaha to discuss options. They had pooled funds for barbed wire, for watchtowers, for hiring outriders. But none of it was working. Someone, the minutes do not record who, suggested they needed a weapon that could reach out and make a stand credible, something that would let a handful of defenders hold ground until help arrived. Marsh was invited to consult. He brought with him a prototype, a Sharps rifle that he had rebarreled and sighted. Along with a box of ammunition, he had loaded himself using a powder charge 30 grains heavier than standard and bullets he had cast in a custom mold. On a firing range outside the city, he demonstrated the rifle's capability by striking a man-sized target at 650 yards, 5 shots in succession, each round placed within a 12-inch circle. The delegation placed an order the following week, but Marsh did not simply deliver rifles. He delivered a system. Each rifle was accompanied by detailed instructions that went far beyond basic marksmanship. The single-page sheet, copies of which survive in the Nebraska State Historical Society archives, described not only how to load and fire the weapon, but how to read wind by observing grass movement and dust patterns, how to estimate range using the width of a man's shoulders as a unit of measure, how to brace the rifle against a solid rest to minimize tremor, and how to adjust the tang sight for temperature and elevation. More importantly, Marsh insisted that every settlement purchasing the rifles send at least 2 men to Omaha for a week of training. Over the course of 18 months, he personally instructed 93 settlers, farmers, shopkeepers, former soldiers, even a Lutheran pastor from Grand Island, in the fundamentals of long-range precision shooting. He taught them to control their breathing, to squeeze rather than pull the trigger, to understand the arc of the bullet's flight and the need to aim high when shooting uphill. He taught them to think in terms of zones of control, how a single, well-placed rifleman on high ground could dominate a 500-yard radius and make approach costly enough to discourage it. The first recorded engagement involving one of Marsh's rifles occurred on July 9, 1872, at a settlement called Cottonwood Springs, 16 miles west of present-day North Platte. A raiding party, estimated at between 12 and 15 riders, approached the cluster of 6 cabins shortly after dawn, driving off a small herd of cattle. 2 settlers, brothers named Heinrich and Otto Becker, had been on watch in a sod-roofed dugout on the eastern edge of the property. Heinrich carried one of the Marsh rifles. According to a statement filed with the territorial authorities 3 days later, he engaged the raiders at a measured distance of 430 yards, firing 7 rounds over the course of perhaps 10 minutes. The raiders withdrew without closing to within 200 yards of the cabins. 2 horses were found dead along their line of retreat. No settlers were injured. The cattle were recovered the following afternoon. The pattern repeated. At Plum Creek in August, at Wood River in September, at Lone Tree Station in October. Each time, a small number of defenders with Marsh rifles held off larger forces by engaging them at distances that made approach prohibitively dangerous. The rifles did not win battles in any conventional sense. They prevented battles from happening at all. A man on horseback, aware that he might be struck from a quarter-mile away by a shooter he could not see or reach, would think twice about pressing an attack. The psychological effect was as important as the ballistic reality. But there was something else, a detail that began appearing in the reports, and that would later fuel speculation about what Marsh had really created. In 11 separate engagements documented between July of 1872 and October of 1873, witnesses reported that the first shot, fired from a Marsh rifle, was invariably a miss, striking the ground 10 to 15 yards short of the intended target. The second shot, fired within 30 seconds, would be on target. This pattern was so consistent that some settlers began to describe it as deliberate, a warning shot meant to announce the presence of a long-range capability before engaging in earnest. But Marsh's training notes, recovered from his shop after his death, suggest a different explanation. He had instructed his students to always fire a ranging shot, a deliberate miss, aimed slightly low, to observe the dust cloud it raised and thereby confirm wind drift and bullet drop before committing to a killing shot. It was a tactic borrowed from artillery. Walk the fire onto the target rather than trusting a cold-bore calculation. In an era when most men fired until they saw dirt kick up near their target and then adjusted, Marsh was teaching systematic precision. The territorial governor's office took notice. In December of 1872, a memorandum was circulated among the regional military posts asking for evaluations of the Marsh rifle and its effectiveness in frontier defense. The responses varied. A captain at Fort McPherson wrote that the weapon was useful, but noted that it required a level of training and discipline that most settlers could not sustain. A lieutenant at Sydney Barracks described it as a force multiplier that allowed small stationary defensive positions to punch above their weight. A major at Fort Kearny questioned whether arming civilians with such capable rifles might create long-term security risks, suggesting that the weapons could easily fall into hostile hands or be used in feuds between settlers. But the most detailed assessment came from a civilian scout named Abel Croft, who had been hired by the Army to investigate patterns of raiding activity along the Platte. Croft's report, dated January 15, 1873, runs to 11 handwritten pages and resides in the National Archives. In it, he describes visiting 7 settlements where Marsh rifles had been deployed and interviewing both defenders and, in 2 cases, captured raiders who had survived encounters with the weapons. Croft noted that the rifles themselves were well made, but not extraordinary by the standards of the day. Similar long-range Sharps rifles were available commercially, and some buffalo hunters were achieving even greater ranges with heavier calibers. What set the Marsh system apart, Croft concluded, was the standardization of training and the emphasis on disciplined fire. Settlers equipped with the rifles did not panic and empty their weapons in rapid, inaccurate volleys. They fired slowly, methodically, and almost always from prepared positions that maximized their advantage. Croft's report included a striking observation. In every engagement he examined, the defenders had fired an average of fewer than 3 rounds per minute, yet their hit rate was estimated at better than 40%, a figure that approached the performance of trained military snipers. Then came the incident at Willow Island. On the afternoon of August 22, 1873, a combined party of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, numbering somewhere between 30 and 40 men, attacked a wagon train that had stopped to water livestock at a bend in the Platte near Willow Island, roughly midway between Fort Kearny and Fort McPherson. The train consisted of 8 wagons carrying 11 families, mostly German immigrants, bound for the newly opened lands in the Kearny area. They had no military escort. The attack began just after 2 o'clock, with mounted warriors sweeping in from the north and cutting the train off from the river. The wagons circled, and the settlers returned fire with whatever weapons they had: shotguns, revolvers, a few old Enfield-rifled muskets. The situation was grim. They were outnumbered 3 to 1, low on water, and pinned in open ground with minimal cover. What the raiders did not know was that one of the wagons carried a Marsh rifle and that the man holding it, a 46-year-old blacksmith named Johann Weiss, had completed Marsh's training course in Omaha the previous spring. Weiss took up a position under the bed of the rearmost wagon, using a stack of grain sacks to steady the rifle. The warriors were circling at a range of roughly 300 yards, moving at speed, making themselves difficult targets. Weiss waited. He watched the patterns of their movement, noted the direction of the wind by observing the dust kicked up by the horses, and adjusted his sight picture accordingly. Then he fired his ranging shot, deliberately aiming 10 yards ahead of the lead rider. The bullet struck the ground in a puff of dust. The warriors did not react. they had been fired on before and knew that most settler weapons could not reach them at that distance. Weiss adjusted his hold, breathed out, and fired again. The lead rider went down, tumbling from his horse in a cloud of dust and loose gear. The circling stopped. The warriors pulled back to 400 yards, regrouped, and then came in again from a different angle. Weiss fired 5 more rounds over the next 20 minutes, striking 2 more riders and killing a horse. Each shot was deliberate, carefully timed, and devastating. By 3 o'clock, the raiders had withdrawn entirely, falling back to the north and disappearing into the broken country beyond the river. The wagon train reached Fort Kearny the following day. Weiss's account was recorded by the post adjutant, and the incident was reported in the Omaha Daily Bee on August 27th. The newspaper story described Weiss as a hero and credited the Marsh rifle with saving the lives of everyone in the train. Within a week, 3 more settlement committees had placed orders for the rifles. But the Army's interest took a different turn. In September of 1873, a lieutenant colonel named Marcus Haverfield arrived in Omaha with instructions to evaluate the Marsh rifle for potential adoption as a standard cavalry weapon. Haverfield was a career officer, a veteran of the Overland Campaign and the subsequent Indian Wars, and he approached the assignment with a skepticism born of 2 decades spent watching civilians oversell their inventions to the military. He met with Marsh, examined the rifles, reviewed the training materials, and then arranged for a field demonstration. Marsh took him to the same range outside Omaha where he had first demonstrated the rifle to the settlement delegation. Haverfield brought along a captain and a sergeant, both experienced marksmen. Over the course of an afternoon, Marsh and his students demonstrated the rifle's capability at ranges from 300 to 700 yards under varying wind conditions against both stationary and moving targets. Haverfield's official report, submitted to the Department of the Platte on October 3, 1873, is preserved in the Army records and runs to 6 pages. He concluded that the Marsh rifle was indeed capable of exceptional accuracy and that the training protocols were sound. However, he recommended against adoption for general cavalry use. His reasoning was practical. The rifle was too long and heavy for mounted combat, the ammunition was expensive, and the level of training required to use it effectively was beyond what the Army could realistically provide to line soldiers. But he made a second recommendation, one that would have long-term implications. He suggested that the Army create a small cadre of specialist marksmen, no more than 2 per company, who would be equipped with rifles of this type and trained to provide precision fire support during defensive engagements or when covering the movement of other troops. He noted that such marksmen would not replace conventional soldiers, but would act as a force multiplier, much as they had for the settlers on the Platte. The recommendation was filed and quietly forgotten, buried in the usual bureaucratic churn. But it did not disappear entirely. In the spring of 1874, an officer at Fort Leavenworth, a major named William Sturgis, who had served as an instructor at the same post where Marsh once taught, began experimenting with the creation of just such a specialist cadre. Sturgis selected 6 soldiers from his regiment, men who had demonstrated aptitude for marksmanship and temperament suited to patient, methodical work. He obtained 3 Sharps rifles from civilian sources, including one of Marsh's modified weapons, and began training the men using principles drawn directly from Marsh's instruction sheets. The program was informal, unauthorized, and conducted during off-duty hours. Sturgis kept no official records, but in letters to his brother, a civilian living in Ohio, he described the progress of his students and his belief that the Army was underutilizing the potential of precision marksmanship. Then, in July of 1874, Ezekiel Marsh died. The circumstances were mundane. He contracted pneumonia during a wet spring, ignored the advice of a doctor to rest, and continued working in his shop until he collapsed. He was dead within a week. His estate was minimal: the shop, some tools, a small savings account. The shop was sold, the tools auctioned off. Among the items recovered from his workbench was a leather-bound notebook containing detailed records of every rifle he had built, every student he had trained, and a series of observations on what he called elevation disciplines, methods for improving hit probability at extreme range by accounting for variables like barrel temperature, powder humidity, and even the curvature of the earth over distances beyond 1,000 yards. The notebook was purchased by an Omaha gunsmith named Harlan Pierce for $3. Pierce read it, understood perhaps a tenth of what it contained, and filed it away in a drawer. The Marsh rifles continued to serve along the Platte for years. As the frontier moved west and the settlements became towns, the rifles were passed down or sold off, their origins forgotten. A few ended up in museums. Most simply vanished into private collections or were destroyed. But the pattern they established, small unit defensive precision, long-range interdiction, psychological deterrence, did not vanish. It appeared again in different forms in later conflicts. During the Spanish-American War, Army marksmanship instructors at Fort Sill began training soldiers in what they called outpost defense, using Springfield rifles to engage targets at ranges up to 600 yards. The training manual they used borrowed language almost verbatim from Marsh's instruction sheets. During World War I, when the Army created its first formal sniper training program, the curriculum included sections on ranging shots and systematic fire that echoed the techniques Marsh had taught settlers on the Nebraska plains. And during World War II, when the Marine Corps developed its Scout Sniper doctrine, an officer named Howard Toft, a Nebraska native who had grown up hearing stories about the Marsh rifles, incorporated elements of that frontier system into the training he designed at Camp Lejeune. The rifle itself became a ghost, a piece of hardware that had served its purpose and faded. But the idea behind it endured. In 1987, a historian named Elizabeth Kern published a monograph titled Precision and the Frontier, examining the role of long-range marksmanship in the settlement of the Great Plains. Kern had located 14 surviving Marsh rifles, interviewed descendants of settlers who had used them, and obtained copies of Haverfield's report and Croft's assessment from the archives. She argued that the Marsh system represented an overlooked turning point in American military thought, the recognition that a small number of highly trained specialists could achieve effects out of proportion to their numbers. She noted that while the settlers themselves had seen the rifles simply as tools for survival, military observers had understood them as something more, a proof of concept for what would later be called force projection through precision. Kern's work attracted little attention outside academic circles, but in 1991, a retired Army officer named Charles Denton read the monograph and recognized parallels to his own experience as a sniper instructor during the Vietnam War. Denton had trained soldiers to operate alone or in pairs, engaging targets at long range and then withdrawing before the enemy could react, a direct descendant of the tactics Marsh had taught. Denton wrote to Kern, and they began a correspondence that lasted nearly a decade. In 2001, they co-authored an article for a military history journal tracing the lineage of American sniper doctrine from the frontier to the present day. They concluded that while technology had evolved, scopes had replaced iron sights, ballistic computers had replaced notebook tables, the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Know your weapon, know your target, know your range, and fire with discipline. But there was one element of the story that neither Kern nor Denton could fully explain. In reviewing the documented engagements involving Marsh rifles, they found that in 17 cases where defenders successfully repelled attacks, the average number of shots fired per defender was 4.3 rounds. The average engagement time was 14 minutes, and yet the casualty ratio, attackers killed or wounded per defender, averaged 2.7 to 1, a figure that approached the performance of modern military snipers operating with vastly superior equipment. Even accounting for the advantage of prepared positions and the psychological impact of long-range fire, the numbers seemed improbably high. Kern and Denton speculated that there might have been additional training, unrecorded sessions, word-of-mouth techniques that Marsh had shared with his students but never committed to paper. Or perhaps the success rate was inflated by the limitations of 19th century casualty reporting. They acknowledged the uncertainty, but let the question stand. The last known engagement involving a Marsh rifle occurred on October the 7th, 1876, near the town of Ogallala. A settler named Thomas Brennan used one of the rifles to drive off a group of cattle thieves who had been harassing ranches in the area. Brennan fired 6 shots at an estimated range of 520 yards, striking one man and scattering the rest. The local newspaper reported the incident in a single paragraph, noting only that Brennan was an excellent shot and that the thieves had not returned. There was no mention of the rifle's origins, no acknowledgment of Marsh or the system he had built. By that point, the frontier was closing. The railroads had connected the plains, and the era of isolated settlements holding out against raids was coming to an end. The rifles were no longer needed, but the legacy remained, encoded in doctrine and training manuals, passed down through generations of soldiers who never knew the name Ezekiel Marsh, or understood that the techniques they were learning had been refined on the Nebraska plains a century before. In 2012, a collector in Colorado purchased a Sharps rifle at an estate sale. It was in poor condition, the stock cracked, the barrel pitted with rust. But when he disassembled it for cleaning, he found a marking on the underside of the barrel tang, a small stamped notation reading M-Spec 71. He researched the marking, found Kern's monograph, and realized he was holding one of the original Marsh rifles. He contacted the Nebraska State Historical Society, which arranged for the rifle to be conserved and added to their collection. It is now on display in Lincoln in a glass case alongside a reproduction of Marsh's instruction sheet and a photograph of Johann Weiss, the blacksmith who held off 30 warriors at Willow Island with 7 carefully aimed shots. The rifle weighs 9 pounds. It is 44 inches long. And if you look closely at the buttstock, worn smooth by a century and a half of handling, you can still see faint letters scratched into the wood, a name that no longer means anything to anyone, but that once represented the difference between survival and abandonment for 17 small settlements on the edge of the American frontier. You stand in the museum, looking at the rifle through the glass, and you think about the men and women who carried it, who learned to read wind and estimate range and fire with the kind of discipline that most people never achieve at anything. You think about the settlements that survived because someone had thought ahead, had understood that survival on the frontier required not just courage, but precision, not just firepower, but knowledge. You think about Marsh, dead at 45, his work forgotten by everyone except a handful of scholars and collectors, his notebooks moldering in a drawer until someone finally understood what they contained. You think about the pattern, the way an idea can move through time and space, changing form but never really disappearing, surfacing in different conflicts and different contexts, but always recognizable to those who know how to look. And you wonder how many other innovations, how many other systems born of necessity and refined by desperate men on the edges of civilization are still with us, still shaping the way we think and fight and survive, even though we no longer remember where they came from. What other ghosts are we carrying forward, invisible and essential, waiting to be rediscovered?